In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. When the philosopher studies any object, he studies three things: its essence, its powers, and its actions. The essence is, what is it? That's where you try to define. Its powers are like attributes, like qualities with which it is endowed by its very nature for whatever purpose it was intended. And then its actions. In the case of man, there is a fourth topic, and that's habits. And that's one of the terms that has to become much stronger in our thinking than before we started the course. The philosophic meaning of the word habit. And why is there in man a fourth category? That's because of all beings, man's powers are not fitted to function immediately. Almost every animal is equipped by nature with all the powers needed for whatever it is meant to be and to do. But in the case of man, these powers have to be further disciplined, educated, perfected, and that's where habits come. So habits come as a medium between the powers and the actions. And in general, you say, what would be habits in the philosophic sense? They divide into three classes: the virtues, and when they are deficient, the vices, but that's the same category. In other words, the moral habits, or immoral, in many cases they are. The skills, and that is where man is a maker. And man as a maker is considered by the philosophers as an artist. So the word artist in philosophy has a much larger field than the way we use it in modern speech. There is an art aspect to everything man does. How does it differ from the moral aspect? The moral aspect relates to the doer. The art aspect relates to the thing being made. And Father used to spend nights explaining the difference between do and make. The do stays in you. The make is transient. It produces something outside of you. Art is concerned with the object made outside of man. Morals are concerned with the doing of the thing as it relates to the perfection of the one doing them. And the third category of the habits pertain to knowledge, the different sciences. So now, what are the three kinds of habit? The virtues, the skills, and the sciences. And you see right away that a child can grow and he will be empowered with all these faculties that we are going to be talking about. He could become a carpenter, but he need not become a carpenter. He has to be disciplined to the skill of carpentry. You see where the habit comes in. He could become a violinist, but there's nothing in man that would turn him into a violinist the way the bee spontaneously is turned into a builder of hives. It's not automatic. If he does not go through the discipline, he would never acquire the art, the skill. And the same way with the sciences. Every man has the mind to learn algebra. Some have more interest in it than others, more sharpness about it than others, but everyone could learn algebra. But he doesn't need to learn algebra, and it is not automatic. If he doesn't study it, he doesn't get it. So all civilization resides in these habits: the virtues, the skills, and the sciences. And we shall learn to think about these things philosophically. The scholastic philosophers, or I prefer to say the philosophers of Philosophia Perennis, the wisdom philosophy, discuss these things in terms of the application of man's reason to under one definite aspect. And so they use a definition that has all the terms the same except one crucial word changing. So they defined art as recta ratio factibilium. Recta ratio. These two words are going to repeat in every one. Ratio refers to reason. Recta, correctness. The correct application of reason, you might say. That's recta ratio. Factibilium, with regard to the thing to be made. And that's the object of art. In that sense, the object could be a bridge well built, a chair well made, or a symphony well performed, you see. You got the idea of how they think of. The making does not need to be something material like a chair. It could be a performance, like a song well sung or a musical piece well played. Morality they defined as recta ratio agibilium, the correct application of reason to the things that to be done. So the English verbs that were favorites with father and taught us a great deal of liberal education by talking about them, the cynics began to say, oh, father is going to be talking again about made and do, you know. That's the way they missed the point. They missed the whole wisdom of the crusade, and that's why they worked out on it. So in Latin, the two words are facere, to make, and agere, to do. So in Latin, there are two excellent words corresponding. We should put it the other way around. We are fortunate to have in English two excellent words to correspond to the classical verbs. When you come to knowledge, scientia, recta again, recta ratio, they come the same. So that means there's a common generic aspect to these three types of perfection we call the habits that are needed to intermediate between the powers with which we are born and the performance that is expected of us, or that we choose in our vocation of life to do. So all culture, all civilization, all education, whether at home, in the school, in society, involves these three perfections. Recta ratio in science, cognoscibilium, the correct application of reason with regard to the things to be known. And it's a very, very important thing to know that these things, while sometimes you can give an example and say, give me an example of art, and you say, well, a person playing the piano or playing the violin, or a person who has the skill to paint and is painting a picture, you see, that's art. To the philosophers, they say a man making a chair and making a good chair, being an artist in making the chair, building a bridge. Give me an example of morals. Well, a man doing something courageous, charitable, pleasing to God, just. Give me an example of science. Well, a man solving a problem in mathematics, or doing works in chemistry or astronomy or biology or something like that. But when you stop to think about it, again, as we constantly say, we distinguish, we do not divide. These three are aspects of almost everything a man does. Every single thing a man does has a little aspect of art, a little aspect of scientia, and always an aspect of morality. I was challenged once to say, somebody picking blueberries, do you need to have the three? I said, yes, you do. First you have to know not to pick something poisonous. You have to know what blueberries are and where to find them. That's the scientia aspect. There's a little art to doing it, not too much, but a child could learn it very quickly, but you don't pull the roots of the plant as you do it. And the moral aspect, well, if you are doing it today, is it what you should be doing? Maybe you should be at Mass, on Sunday. Maybe you are stealing them from somebody. They don't belong to you. You see, that's the moral aspect. So you couldn't propose to me anything man can be doing that doesn't have the three aspects and always involves reason. Everything man does humanly. When we come to study the acts of man, actus humanus, that's the foundation of all moral philosophy. So I'm a little bit anticipating my subjects because I always believe that if you know what you are aiming at, you will be more interested in how we are building up to it. Every single thing that man does has a little science aspect, a little art aspect, a skill, and a moral aspect. A lady cooking the meal for her family. Is there a little art cooking? Of course. Are there things she should know? Is there a little science that goes along with it? Certainly. Is there a moral aspect to it? Yes. Charity, everything that man is doing has to be just, charitable, part of our love for God, our love for neighbor. So there is a moral aspect to it too. So let me review now, very simply, what are the three things that a philosopher studies in every being? Its essence, its powers, and its actions. What is the fourth thing that's required because of the peculiar being that man is? Habits. All right. And we see now under habits we have science, art, and morality, and therefore everything that civilization is concerned with. So what we are studying now is a foundation of a complete philosophy of civilization. And when we come to study human actions, we will discover that no action is moral until it is directed towards the end. This word end is one of the words that we began to appreciate even from our cosmology course. One of the things cosmology taught us was to discover the teleology even of the material universe. Another value we learned from the cosmology course was not only the teleology, how everything seems to have a purpose, but also we learned that in the simplest, most elemental substances, even those lacking life, there is a material principle and an immaterial principle. We have been calling it formal, but remember, formal means immaterial. Now, on that plane, it's immaterial only in the sense that it is not matter, but something that is working on matter, that's giving it determination, giving it form, giving it purpose. And we see the formal, therefore the immaterial principle, in higher and higher planes of being. So we begin to sense, even from cosmology, a sense of a hierarchy of being, where the higher being performs eminently, that means in a superior manner, all the things that the lower forms perform. All these principles are building towards wisdom. We begin to see that ladder of being that all the philosophers were fascinated by. Now, in that ladder of being, absolutely the most wonderful, the most fascinating entity in the whole universe is man himself. Even God agrees with this. He was so fascinated by it that he wanted to adopt that nature to himself. That's the only created nature that God united completely to himself. He said, "My delight is to be with the children of men." The angels are superior in being, but they are nowhere near as exciting, as fascinating as man is. And it somehow in man is a summary of the entire universe. Now, one aspect of us behaves like the minerals, one aspect in us behaves like the vegetables, one aspect in us behaves like the animals, and then one aspect in us which is like the angels. So everything that is in existence is somehow found in summary in man. There is more complexity in the human body than in a galaxy. When you come to a galaxy, and what do you find? Just electrons, protons, atoms, no matter how wide they extend, it's always the same monotonous thing. A few elements and that's it. You come to man, and in every finger of a child, in every eye, in every ear, in the stomach, the variety of textures, and it's not a meaningless variety. All the elements cooperate to build man. All the even the inanimate elements, if they did not exist and did not behave the way they do. It's funny, this morning a philosophic thought came to me when I almost slipped on the ice. And after I regained my balance, it occurred to me how quickly we take it for granted that we can walk. Think of how many things have to be performing correctly according to the nature given into them to make it possible for a man on 2 feet to keep his balance and keep walking. Now, lest we completely take things for granted and therefore cease to have any gratitude to our providential maker who arranged these things for us, every once in a while God makes them a little difficult, so that is able to, so don't take them too much for granted. How easily we take the air for granted. Just imagine that for thousands and thousands of years, every once in a while somebody suffocates because either they put him in a room where there was not enough oxygen or something. But when these exceptions occur, they emphasize the billions of times. Think of the billions of people in the world today. They all have air to breathe. So these are the things that are so easy to take for granted. And part of a philosophic discipline is to make us have a deeper appreciation for them. So, by way of review, and so in case you get tired of my method of approach, let me read you a few lines from a good philosopher who lived in our country and in our century, Father Paul Glenn, and he taught philosophy all his life. The essence of life. This is a course on life now. When we were in cosmology, we prescinded. Remember that word, prescind? We prescinded from the fact of life. In other words, even when we studied things that were living, we studied them not as living. A bug can be dropped like a pebble. The pebble is not alive, but the insect is alive. But as far as they're dropping under the gravity, they behave the same way. So we are studying things there lacking life. Well, now we are studying things in which life exists. And so, according to our pattern, we have to study first essence. What's almost a synonym of essence? Nature. The definition of nature is the essence of a thing conceived as the principle. The principle, that's a very important word. I'm not going to stop here to define it, but these important words, when they are used correctly, gradually you begin to see what they mean. Nature is the essence of a thing conceived as the principle of what it does, that means action, and what can be done to it. The two categories, when we named the 10 categories, the two categories, action, passion, are the greatest windows into the nature of things. How do we study the nature of a thing? We just watch what it does and what can be done to it, and then we get a sense of its nature. So what's the difference between essence and nature? We say, are they exact synonyms? Essence is more in relation to knowledge. Nature is more in relation to action, causality. But they refer to the same thing. So when we study the essence of things, we are studying their nature. So on the plane of the first of the four things to be studied, Father Glenn is talking about life. Now listen to him talk and see if it squares with the things we have been saying. Our course has been going now for just a couple of weeks, but we have already been saying a few things. We have been learning to think about them. Let us see if that is in harmony with what we have been saying. Definition of life. When you study essence, you define. What's the first thing a philosopher has to do? Define what he's talking about. Who is the first great philosopher in history? Socrates. And what was his contribution? He went around asking people to define what they are talking about. So we define. We are to define the term life, and the term expresses the idea or concept, that is, the mind's essential grasp. So essence has to do with the mind. Essence is the nature as it's given itself to a mind understanding. You see that? While nature is the essence of the thing, dynamic, ready to do something. All right? So the grasp of the mind is equipped to perceive, to apprehend, to take hold of the essence of things. Of the reality called life, our definition is to be at once the explanation of a word or term, of the idea or concept which is expressed by the term, and of the reality or thing of which the mind has the idea and for which the term stands. Now we learned that in logic, didn't we? There are three orders every time man is thinking. What are they? When man is teaching or expressing himself or communicating with others, what are the three orders involved? The order of things, the order of ideas, and the order of words. The things, the ideas in the mind, words expressing the ideas. Now, the freshmen and sophomores in our colleges are always fascinated by the idea that you can play with words. We are defining, it depends on how you define. You know, they can always tell you, well, people use the word life and they all know what it means. They all know what when you say, is it living or is not living? Everybody knows what it means. So it's not just arbitrary. So we are not just defining the word, we are defining the idea that the word expresses. And we are not just talking about the idea, it's not just something in the mind, it's also the thing, the reality. There is a reality called life. There is a difference between living and non-living things. You see that? And that's why I began my course in these areas, in cosmology and psychology, so that we won't think that the whole thing is in the mind. I think that's one of the big problems of people's philosophies today. They think that they are talking about ideas or even about words. They call it nominalism. And these are doors open to sheer sophistry and nonsense. Everybody knows what you mean by life. Now let us see if we can give an intelligent definition of it. And that's where common sense and philosophy are allies. One difference between philosophy as we learn it in Philosophia Perennis and what is going by the name today, you almost end up thinking that we are all abnormal. There's something wrong with all of us. There's no such thing as a healthy human being. They're full of complexes, full of pathological problems and so on. That's why we constantly say that a wholesome mind is one that studies what's normal first. There is a place for the study of what is pathological or abnormal, but first you study what is normal. On the question of the issue of salvation, how salutary that would be, Instead of immediately getting interested of this invincibly ignorant native on the desert island, well, I don't know, one of the 7,000 islands in the Philippines, I guess. Why not consider the problem of most of the people we meet every day in the streets that should be making salvation the first interest of their life? What's keeping them? That have the gospel available, then why aren't they reading? Why aren't they meditating about it? Why aren't they asking questions? Why aren't they going for the people who could help them? That would be the normal approach. That's wisdom. Our definition is to be at once the explanation. So notice that life is the natural capacity of an agent for self-perfective, immanent activity or movement. What is the most sensitive word in that whole definition? The word immanent. Is there life in a computer? Not a hint of it. Why? No immanent action there. They start talking about the computer understanding and remembering and all that. There's no memory, there's no understanding. The whole thing is mechanical. It's mechanical operations. Even if they are electrical, magnetic, no matter what order they are, there is no life there whatsoever. The difference between a camera taking a picture, there's nothing but transient action in a camera. A child looking and seeing the thing and appreciating it. You think the camera is appreciating the color or the beauty, or there's nothing, no immanent action. You see now how understanding, thinking, remembering are all life actions. Everybody knows it by common sense. Everybody laughs when you try to talk about, I mean, even they can become that stupid that they take these things seriously and think that there is actual life in the computer. But actually, a man of common sense laughs when he talks about it. They know the difference. But the philosopher gives you the crucial reality on which the whole thing depends. There is immanent, when there is immanent action and self-perfective, that means it's purposive. When a little seed is put in the ground, and the first chance it has, little humidity, sunlight falling on it, right away roots are being sent. These roots are self-perfective. That seed is meant to have the inclination to become a tree, to become a plant. There's a certain perfect ideal towards which it is directed, not by any knowledge in itself, but certainly by a mind that made it to behave that way. The more you think about these things correctly, the more you see the absurdity of thinking that things like that could be happening with no intelligence anywhere directing them. This is rather a definition of life in first act. Now I keep telling you all along what the philosopher using that word first. First act. We may define life in second act simply as self-movement. Now let me see if we can see that distinction. First act. Life in first act is that the thing is alive. He could be sleeping, he could be showing no sign of life at the moment, but he is alive. Now, take a dog. A dog is sleeping, and at the moment, he might as well be dead. But he is capable of hearing. That's immanent action. He's capable of hearing. When he begins to hear, in the language of philosophy, hearing is an action or a movement, really. It's a movement. Changing from the non-hearing to the hearing, there is a movement there. That's the philosophic use of the word. And it is immanent. That is life in second act. You see, life in first act is something simple. What makes that body alive? That's it. Now, what did I tell you once about first and second? What is second depends for what it is on what is first, and not vice versa. That dog, if it suddenly died, supposing you electrocute it, you destroy life in first act, all the acts of second act automatically disappear. After that, it can neither see, nor hear, nor smell, nor jump and run. nor digest its food, nor look for food to eat. You see? All these are vital acts, but they are vital acts in second act. But the first act, on which all of them depend, is the fact that the body as such is alive. You see that? So that's the way Father Glenn introduces us to the definition of life. That's concerned with that first thing we called what the thing is, the whatness. Whatness, that's another way of defining, of naming essence. Whatness. In Latin they call it quiddity. From quid est, what is it? So the quiddity of the thing is what answers the question, what is it? That's the essence. Let us see Father Glenn introduce us to the notion of faculty. Now that's another thing they laugh at. They say they believe in faculties, the faculties of the mind and so on. The modern positivists, when they refer to the philosophy of St. Thomas or the scholastic philosophers, they call them faculty psychology. You know, and they just dismiss it as something ridiculous. There's nothing funny about it, and it's an area where we can all check in our own personal experience to see how true it is. How does he describe what you mean by faculty? What's a synonym for faculty? Power. You can say the powers of the soul or the faculties of the soul. There is a Latin word, facultas, ability or power, which derives from the verb facere, to make or to do. The English word faculty has its ancestry in 3 Latin words. A faculty is a capacity or power for making or doing. It is also a capacity or power for receiving, but not for receiving in a lifeless and passive way, like that in which molding clay receives the shape impressed upon it. Now, there's a difference between the camera receiving and the eye receiving. You see the difference? The eye has to receive. The eye has to be passive. In other words, it has to be ready to receive the object, the color that comes to it. If it already has a color, it's not a good knowledge faculty. To some extent, it has to be passive, but it's a passivity that's vital. It's an active passivity, if you can allow the notion. While in a camera, it's like when you take a seal and stamp it on hot wax, that's nothing but dead passivity. There's sheer passivity there. But when you have our faculties impressed by an object from the outside, there is both a reception and a grasp, so to speak, a grasping. A faculty, inasmuch as it is a capacity for receiving, is a capacity for actively receiving. Perhaps we had better say it is a capacity for vitally reacting to what it receives. For a faculty, strictly understood, is a vital capacity or power. It belongs always to a living substance. A faculty may be defined as, now notice the definition, the immediate and proximate principle of vital operation. Now that is a definition worth remembering. We add it to those very simple definitions that are the foundation of all intelligence. Just as we define life as immanent action, well, how do we define a faculty? It's the immediate and proximate. Why does he say the proximate principle? What would be the ultimate principle? The soul. Life in actu primo. Life in first act. See that? The faculty of sight, which needs an organ of sight. The soul could have that faculty, but if something injured the organ, the faculty will remain in the soul, but it will not be able to exercise it. What's the organ for the faculty of sight? The eye. Now, you see how the eye is the proximate principle. The power of sight is the proximate principle of seeing. But what's the ultimate principle of seeing? The existence of the soul in the body. So you destroy the soul from the body, and you'll have the eye staring at you, seeing nothing. You see that? You see the difference between the proximate and the ultimate. A man, for example, sees. Seeing is a vital operation. Now the principle of that operation is that from which the operation proceeds. And in the operation of seeing, the word operatio in Latin corresponds to the word axio. They mean the same thing. Operation, don't think now of the operation room and surgery and all that. Operatio means the operations of the thing are its actions. So we add this now to our definitions. A faculty is the immediate and proximate principle of vital operations. Give me an example. A vital operation is seeing. What's the ultimate principle of seeing? Life in the soul in the body, life in the body. What's the proximate principle of seeing? The power of sight, which presupposes a healthy organ to be exercised. It's the proximate and immediate. So, with this introduction to the notion of faculty, I would now prepare you for a very important part of our course. Before the course is over, you should be able to name all the powers or faculties that are found in our human nature. Now, when we come to study the immaterial, there will be things we have to learn and trust our thinking entirely. But when we are talking about man, everything you learn, you check it immediately in your own personal experience. In man, there are three genera. There are 5 genera. Genera is the plural of genus. There are 5 kinds, you might say now, let us not use too technical language. There are 5 kinds of powers. And let me name them once. The vegetative, which we share with all plants. The sentient, which divides into 2. The cognitive sentient and the appetitive sentient. The word appetitive means involves desire. The word cognition means it involves knowledge. So once you come to the sentient level, 2 things immediately emerge, and a third follows. What are the 2 things? Knowledge. For the first time, you have a being with a kind of knowledge. A dog can see the bone at a distance and go after it. A plant cannot see water until it touches it physically. People have been making the wrong comparison. They say if you plant a willow tree near a lake, you find the roots going towards the water. You think, you know, that the willow saw the water there, say that's where I will send my roots. The humidity comes from that direction, and that's why the roots move in that direction. It has to reach physically and touch. There is no knowledge on the plant life. But once you come to the sentient life, there is a kind of knowledge. Now we shall see later how to distinguish between that kind of knowledge and the more immaterial knowledge that we have when we come to intellectual knowledge. Now these are the distinctions that have to be made for a wise understanding of nature, of human nature. These are required for us to reach the conclusion of the difference between the human soul and the animal soul, to reach the conclusion of the immortality of the soul, which is one of the most important theses of philosophy. So what are the 5 genera of powers or faculties in man? The vegetative, the sentient, the appetitive. Leave the sentient on the side of knowledge, but the appetite is also a sentient power, but it's sentient in a derivative sense because it's a desire following on knowledge. See? So, on the plane above the material organs of the body, we have two powers. Now, we are not proving anything yet, but we are learning what we need to prove. Knowledge and appetency occur also above the organic body in the two faculties we call intellect and will. So, to name all the powers of the soul and to be able to distinguish them and talk intelligently about them, we know that on the vegetative plane there are three distinct powers. And what are they? Nutrition, growth, and reproduction or generation. Every living thing has to nourish itself, has to grow, when life is in matter, there's always growth. Always begins small and starts growing into a more developed, more perfect form. And every form of life in matter has to have a way of reproducing its kind. The individual dies, but the species must continue. That's the vegetative plane. Notice, we could be studying these things by talking about plants. And if we had an infinity of time at our hands, maybe that would be the better way to do it. We could spend a long time studying different kinds of plants and how they do it and all that. But since all these things occur also in man, we study them in man. There is a vegetative plane in man. And that's where we study them. So, nutrition, growth, and generation. These are the three vegetative powers. On the sentient plane, they divide into the outer senses and the inner senses. Now they are fussy today, they tell you there's more than one touch sense and all that. But for the philosopher, he doesn't care about that. I mean, there's no harm about doing it when you are studying experimental, to discover that some nerves feel heat, others feel pressure, others feel, that you can subdivide the touch power into subdivisions of it. But for our purpose, as long as men have been talking, they speak of the five outer senses, and we should be able to name them. I think we all can name them. Beginning from the lowest, touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight. There are four inner senses, and that's what we have to study more carefully because they are not as obvious. The modern psychologists don't like to use the word sensus communis. When you translate it to English, common sense, well, we use the word common sense in an entirely different meaning. They call it the synthesizing inner sense or something. It's that to which all the outer senses and the inner senses report, to form an object. Like when I say apple, I don't only think of a color, I also think of a smell, of a taste, of all kinds, of a tactile feeling, all that. So all these things have to meet together. Otherwise there will be one world of sight, one world of hearing, and they will never form one object. And that's what the philosophers call that inner sense. I will choose the best word. The different writers, I think they call it the synthesizing inner sense or something like that. But if you want to continue to use it in the language of St. Thomas, as you find it in the Summa Theologica, keep it Latin, sensus communis, the common sense, right? The imagination, the memory, the sense memory, and the cogitative sense, that is the most difficult one to understand, and I will leave it for later discussion. So how many sense powers do we have? 9. 5 outer senses, 4 inner senses. We will learn to talk about them much more than that, but for the moment, just name them. On the appetitive side, our appetites subdivide into the concupiscible and the irascible. Now, first, dissociate the word concupiscible from concupiscence, which is one of the effects of original sin. When we speak of the concupiscence in man, we are not talking only about the concupiscibles, but we are talking about all that whole field, whether concupiscible or irascible, under the aspect of their not being completely subject to our rational nature as they should be. That's what we mean by concupiscence. But the powers in themselves are innocent, and they are not even remotely related to something evil or sinful. I mean, they are powers put in our nature by God, and every one of them can be legitimately exercised to its proper object. And we shall see how true that is. We are not Stoics. We don't believe that the suppression of all our appetites and our passions is the ideal of virtue. We say they have to be ruled by reason, and we will see later that by reason enlightened by grace. But then, what's the difference between the concupiscibles and the irascibles? The concupiscibles relate to an object, whether good or bad, that simply, no difficulty attached to it. Like if a fly is bothering you and you flip it away and it goes, you don't get your fighting equipment aroused. But if it starts assaulting you stubbornly and so on, well, then you become furious. You are angry. You are now. Notice that the vegetative powers we share with the plants, the sentient powers we share with the animals, and they all have a purpose. Now we are studying teleology on a much higher plane and much more evident plane. The fact that a rabbit can get scared when it sees a fox is very good for it. Supposing it just stared at it placidly and no fear arose in it, well, the race of rabbits would be destroyed, would be annihilated. So we begin to learn also another principle, the harmony of attributes. Why with sentient life, the power of locomotion comes in. So on the plane of sentiency, also locomotion comes in. And every sentient being have some power of locomotion. Some by swimming, some by flying, some by running, some by creeping, but a living thing always has the power to move. Notice how some survive because they get afraid and they can run fast. Others survive because they are not afraid, but they are strong. So there is a harmony of attributes in every being, and you have to study to see how they correspond to each other. There is a place to hope, there is a place to despair. I say, should man despair? No, we shouldn't despair of the mercy of God or have ultimate despair. That's sinful. But if you are starting a job and it's obviously not going to lead you anywhere, if you don't despair of it to start something else, you get stuck. There is a place to despair. I mean, we have to study all these things and see that every one of them is correct when it is used with its proper object. Concupiscence in man, in our fallen nature, is the fact that these powers, while they should be subject to our rational nature, since the fall of Adam, they are not. And that's where morality comes in. Now we have to put them back under control. Now then, notice above all this plant life in us, and even below that, the mineral life in us, the mineral existence in us. Because almost every mineral has some part in the structure of man. But once it is informed by the soul, it ceases to be the mineral on its own. There could be water in our bodies that we just drank and has not been assimilated and is not yet informed, and just water. It could be dirty water or mixed in with other things and so on, but it is water. But there is water in the eye, and it is a humanized water. There is water in, and it's humanized organically. It's there to do the function of the eye function, for sight, for a purpose. There is water in the heart, but it's also humanized water. You see what I mean by, it doesn't say just sheer water. Now that's very important. Otherwise, man ceases to be an unum per se, a substantial unit, and he becomes just a conglomerate of different things, each one on its own. So you have to get the tremendous importance of perceiving the oneness of man, the unity of man. Above all these powers that presuppose organic, the organic material body to be performed, there are powers that we have to prove philosophically and can be proved philosophically to have, where immateriality has so prevailed that the power is not, it's intrinsically dependent on matter. While this life lasts, there could be some extrinsic dependence, and we shall see to what extent that goes. But when we come to the, we go above the organic body, we have intellect and will. And the intellect and the will are not organic, they are not located. People think that we think with the brain. We do need the brain when we think, as well as this life lasts, for the inner senses, for the reception of the outer senses, for providing memories and impressions and so on. But thought as such is not located in an organ. At least, I'm not proving it now, but I'm telling you the fact that philosophy will prove that our two powers of intellect and will are supermaterial, therefore spiritual. Well, I think that's enough for tonight, and we'll have a few minutes for questions. Any questions?
In the cognitive inner sense, the recognition of something from outside with something in the memory, and the linking them together so that you will become aware of what that is that what that means?
Well, the first inner sense we think about is that sensus communis, where all the senses, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the taste, they communicate, they report, where you form a sensible object with every sense contributed to it, external sense. But the memory is also a cognitive sense. When you remember something that happened 2 years ago, that's knowing, isn't it? And you are not seeing anything now. There's knowledge coming in memory. How the other faculties, what they call the imagination and the cognitive sense, we are not ready to talk about them. They have to be presented more. But you see, they are cognitive. It's this question of knowing. Some of the things we know are not being presented to us by the senses now, but they come from our memory.
Is knowing a lesser action than intellect, or is it the same thing?
There is knowing that's organic and sense, and there is knowing that's super-organic and intellectual. And we shall see that the two kinds of knowledge exist in man. A man who never saw, suppose a man born blind, there's no use trying to talk to him about red colors, difference between red and blue. You waste your time. If he had never seen red, he's never going to get it. There's no way of conveying it unless it comes through the senses. But once you come to the intellect, even though in man, in this life, the intellectual ideas arise from our sense experience, and we shall study how they arise, they are not, they are extrinsically dependent on the body in this life. Now, when the soul is free from the body, a whole new set of attributes will come into it. We try to anticipate them now. It's very hard to imagine what. But the soul is free to act more like an angel, as a she spirit then. And God gives us, even in the physical nature, little parables of things like that. Like in the life of a silkworm. It begins as a little egg, and then hatches into a larva, and then it seems to have died and turned itself into a pupa, having made its own grave to bury itself in, and you think the whole thing is dead, and then it comes back to life as a moth, flies out into the air. Now, in every one of these stages, there is a complete set of attributes that harmoniously make sense, make it a complete unit thing, but the whole thing grows from one state to the other. And man goes through many stages. In our mortal life, it's one thing. After death, the soul is free from the body and has attributes corresponding to that state. And then after the resurrection, it's restored to unity with the body, but this time immortal, not to be separated again. And these are all the things that studying these things correctly and knowing how to think and meditate on them is tremendously helpful. Father used to say, people imagine when a man is dying, you know, that he's getting less and less conscious and so on, and finally the limit of that is non-existence. He says, the moment of death, the moment the soul is separated from the body, that handicap it had of trying to keep matter alive, it's released completely from it. And he said it is like putting out a candle, but 40,000 lamp power so suddenly shining. I mean, it will be an entirely new state. People today just don't believe in it. In our faith, we believe in it because it's an article of the creed, life everlasting. But we should, our philosophy, our thinking, our reasoning should be always helping these truths of the faith to be much more alive. Did you want to say something?
How would you, the cognitive inner sense, did you say was a judgment based on sense knowledge?
I don't want to enter that. That's the most difficult one of the inner senses to describe. Actually, in the animals, they call it the estimative sense. It's what makes a cat know not to jump a precipice too high, you know, whether it can jump from one place to another if there is a big chasm, you know. I mean, it's that kind of thing. In the animals, it's purely instinctive. But in man, they call it cogitative. It's very close to reason. It's the closest of... In the animals, it is instinct. That fourth sense in the animals is instinct. In man, you could call it instinct because there are also instincts in man. But it does acquire a whole new aspect due to the fact that it's part of a rational nature. But we are going to be saying lots about it. I mean, it's one of the most difficult things to understand in psychology.
Okay, then I'll hold my next question for another time about common sense. But maybe one quick one about dairy. I can see all these other things, even in the animal world. The daring puzzles me because when I think of daring, I think of reason. When I think of an animal, like a mother lion would rescue her baby lion from a fire and dare that. I can understand that, but it seems to puzzle me more with instinct.
Well, I mean, the irascibles go in pairs, except anger has no counterpart, and we shall see why. But daring and fear go together. Like a cat is daring towards a mouse, but has fear when it looks at a fox. I mean, the instinct of daring comes to it in one case, and the fear on the other. It's when danger arises, and there are two different reactions to it. When we come to rational life, the virtue of courage is what regulates these two. And courage is not just daring, it's not animal daring. Some people think that that's all it is. It's knowing how to regulate, how to rule those instincts in us prudently. That's what courage is. It's the virtue that regulates those two. Yes?
I want to get back to this cognitive intellect thing again.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can. I don't know if we quite hit the mark on what I was asking. If in the cognitive, for example, to use the intellect, you would be sitting in a room. You would notice that someone walked into the room soaking wet, and he would say it's raining out. All right. Now, without any further observation, the intellect, correct me if I'm wrong, would sit there and say, let's see now, if I put my plants outside, they'll get wet. And I don't have to water them by putting water on them. They can be done outside. And then they'll grow. And here I am making a long chain of events. That's the intellect working, correct?
Yeah. No, yeah. Like, the intellect can work even when it is dealing with the senses. I mean, man doesn't do anything like an animal. I mean, even the idea of rain is a universal that can't exist in an animal. An animal can see the water falling and even get drenched with it, but he doesn't have the notion of rain. I mean, you see, but the immateriality of the intellect is much more evident when the object is entirely immaterial, like the notion of justice, like the notion of beauty, like the notion of duty, like the notion, I mean, all these concepts that are purely spiritual. But even the idea tree, when you botany, the animals don't talk about botany. I mean, and once you get a universal like that, there's a power there above the senses working. Even when it's working in the medium of the senses.
Okay, so the last part of this question is, if we didn't have these senses, the external, the inners, and the whole sentient part of it, I mean, we know how sometimes it's a joy to think, to use our intellect and to reason, but we don't do it all the time. Sometimes it gets very difficult to do it. Sometimes it becomes a burden. Is it because of our physical body that it holds us down? And once we don't have that burden, we will sort of...
When man is thinking, his brain gets tired because man uses the brain as it's thinking. I mean, what we want to prove later is not that man thinks like a detached spirit, like an angel. I mean, genuine psychology as part of Philosophia Perennis does not exaggerate the independence of the soul, you see. It says that nothing is in the intellect that does not arise from the senses, and when we are thinking, our mind, our imagination has to be working, the memory supplying, working and so on, and man gets tired thinking. But we still can discover in the man thinking that essentially the thought, when it becomes spiritual and intellectual and rational, it is not intrinsically dependent. It's only extrinsically dependent on the body, but not intrinsically dependent. I mean, some people exaggerate the independence of the soul from the body, and that's not Philosophia Perennis. Like Descartes, made it like an angel running a machine, The two things have...
Ghost running a machine.
So it's the most important science for man is man. It's only when we know ourselves that we know how to live, how to direct our actions correctly, and so on. Yes?
What is it with memory? When we try to think of the five senses, when we think of an apple, the memory can handle the color more perfectly, in my imagination, than it can handle smell or taste,
Yeah.
touch. I mean, there is you can imagine smelling something, but But when I imagine seeing something, I can imagine seeing a color very clearly, even though I'm not seeing it with my eyes.
Yeah. But when I bring you another apple, right away, you know it's not the same as the apple you had before. How do you compare the two? If the smell was not retained in memory in your mind, how do you recognize the smell of the new? Say, I've smelled this before. So, I mean, the closer to matter the senses are, and there is an order, you see.
Well, hearing, I can hear it very clearly.
The higher they are,
I can hear it.
like why the eyes and the ears, I mean sight and hearing, are much more for the fine arts.
I can do it.
They are more spiritual, you see, they are more elevated, farther away from matter. The closer they are to matter, you know, there is something a little bit immaterial when you can remember an apple you smelled 5 years ago. But in the order of touch and smell, it's not as, it's too material. Yes?
Brother, what kind of influence do the angels have on our intellect and our will when they can, the bad angels can induce temptation in our minds without any sensations of materiality? And yet we have to fight that off. Now, how do they penetrate into our intellect?
Mm-hmm. They converse. I mean, there are spiritual conversation going on even when we are not sensibly conscious of them. Even when we try to meditate about the nature of prayer, when we are praying, we think only of what we are saying. We don't think that something is being said to us all the time. It's a conversation going on back and forth. And we should be different at the end of the prayer than we were at the start. It's not just we are informing God of the bill for tomorrow, what are the needs. We're saying to Our Lady, pray for us. Do you think every time we say to her, pray for us, she doesn't pray for us? Yes, she does. And when she prays for us, something happens, and our angel does something to us. That should become holier at the end of the prayer than you was at the start, because there is a conversation going on, back and forth. Now, the material, the spiritual dimension of man, we are building up to it, and there will be the time when the treatise on the angels in St. Thomas in the Summa is fascinating. How do the angels converse with each other? You know, some people I meet, they say to me, "We don't pray to the saints; they don't hear us." Immediately, it reminds me of how much we take for granted. We know that saints hear us, otherwise why pray to them? Why say Saint Wahlberger pray for us? If she doesn't hear me, what's the use of saying it? There's conversation in the spiritual order going on all the time.
I think I want to repeat Paul's question again, because I think how does a wicked angel put a bad thought in your mind, or how does a good angel put a good thought? They don't. It's not that automatic, is it? I mean, they don't put the thought. They can arouse your memory.
They can put. They can. There is a part of us that nobody can reach except God. But in our imagination, our good angels can put holy thoughts, holy images in our mind, and the devil could put all kinds of phantasms.
But you think you're doing it?
Well,
they're activating something that you're doing.
If you grasp at it, it's like if somebody came and gave you a book in pornography. I mean, he gave you the book, but when you sit down to read it, then it's your problem. I mean, he put some thought in your head and encouraged that thought, but once you accept it and you start, well, then it becomes yours. But they do, of course they do have a power on us.
Is it telepathy or intention?
I could see it in memory, but I can't see it. I mean, I believe they do. It's hard. I don't know. I can't remember any time that I didn't do it right. You didn't do it myself.
Well, you think you did it yourself.
I don't remember anything coming into my mind that I didn't see or that didn't
I'm
come into
surprised
my
that
memory.
anybody should make that remark. I mean, you know, all the time things happen in your mind that spontaneously, but then after that, whether you dwell on them or you don't dwell on them, that's another thing. Well, what does temptation consist?
Letting the memory get active.
The memory, the phantasm, the power of imagination, and influence, you know, spiritual influence. That's what we're talking about. If you live in an atmosphere of impurity and blasphemy and so on, I mean, influences are working on you. But now, I mean, when they become sensible, of course, everybody realizes, you know, if people around you are swearing every second and using impure language and all that, everybody knows that, or impure pictures are around the place. But what I'm saying here is that even when these things are not there, that materially, they still could be there in the spiritual, in the intellectual level.
And the evil spirits can put you there.
Yeah. That's why God gave us guardian angels, so that we won't be, because we won't be equal to the battle if it were just between us and the devil. And with the more devoted we are to our guardian angels, the more help we get from them. To keep our minds pure, to keep them, you know, prayerful all the time. So. There is nothing more interesting to man to study than man. There's absolutely nothing. And therefore the part of the thing we're in now is, I mean, later on when we'll be studying the science of the immaterial, we'll be talking about that one aspect of man that joins the immaterial, the spiritual. But at the moment we are studying the complete man. And in the complete man, the soul in this mortal life is not independent of the body, far from it. That's not at all either Catholic doctrine or sound philosophy. The soul is not independent of the body, but there is one aspect of it that can be seen to be not intrinsically dependent on materiality. That's all that we prove. We don't prove anything beyond that, but that's enough to show that man is infinitely different from any animal. And when we are truly convinced of that, what difference it makes. Imagine the difference between a being that's going to go on forever and a being that's going to cease to exist forever. I mean, what difference? And that's wisdom. You see, that's where wisdom comes in, with these distinctions. Once a human being is in existence, there's never going to be a time. He's not like God from eternity, but he is a little bit like God for all eternity in the future. There will never be a time that he will cease to exist. He could turn himself into a demon, and he could turn himself into an angel and a saint, but he can never cease to exist. Now that we know from our faith, and we don't need philosophy, you know, but when we know these things, to make them permeate our civilization, we have to have the mediation of philosophy. People stand up and chant the creed every Sunday, and they don't do the slightest bit of thinking about it, as if they haven't said a thing. You could teach it to a parrot, you know, a parrot could recite the creed.
Paris is the creed every Sunday.
Well, I guess we can say a prayer. Name Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Our Lady, seat of wisdom,
Pray for us.
Saint Walburga, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Saint Walburga was an English princess, the daughter of King Saint Richard. And remembering that her race, the Anglo-Saxons, had come from Germany, she got the idea that she should go to the Germanic nations from whom they had originally come, who were still pagan, and work as a missionary among them to convert them. That's the saint of today.